blip we had in 2011 wasn't much of a peak at all. Did anybody in the room operate 6 meters back in the last sunspot cycle? Yeah, so wasn't it great, that second peak that occurred right here? So this was a big deal on the last sunspot cycle, right at the end of 2001. People on the East Coast were working into Japan on 6 meters by F2 propagation. We may never see that again, but do second peaks happen? Yes, they do happen. They don't always happen, and they can be great when they do. And nobody knows if there's going to be a second peak in this cycle. Our lifetimes kind of span this area right here. So take a look at this chart. These are the measurements these are sunspot observations for the last 400 years. And this is an unusually sustained period of high sunspot activity from about the end of World War II up until a few years ago, until the beginning of our cycle. And the big question is this going to go up again over here, or is it going to keep going down? Nobody knows. Sunspot cycle 24 is right here, right up until the day I produced this slide. Anybody notice anything different about sunspot cycle 24 compared to all of the other sunspot cycles since 1944? Way low. Well, good news is, as of this week, it's going back up again. That's good. But it's still going to be the lowest solar minimum in 100 years. That's my opinion. Okay, now, for people who follow predictions that are out there on the web, there's kind of two of them, and they're very different. One is produced by NOAA in cooperation with the Air Force. That's not what this one is, because I don't trust it. And it has some real high numbers. If you look at, these are the actual sunspot numbers here, and these are the NASA predictions from the Marshall Space Flight Center. That's the center that supports the astronauts on the International Space Station. This stuff is real important to them. It has to do with the protection of the lives of the men on the space station. These guys update their forecast every month. NOAA and the Air Force haven't updated their forecast in over 3 years. I tend to trust this one more than the other one. And if you look at what's going on right now with the activity we have, it's kind of tracking this most likely prediction right there. So that NASA would tend to say, yeah, we've been kind of low here for the last nearly a year, since 2011, that peak right here. But they're standing by their forecast, and, you know, maybe they were right. The peak is coming this summer, more or less. Now, there have been lots of years of double sunspot peaks. The sunspot cycle that's most like the one we have now is solar cycle 14. It was 100 years ago. Notice it had 2 peaks, and they were about 2 years apart. So the first question is, when's the first peak in solar cycle 24? Was it back in 2011, or maybe it's going to happen in the next couple of months? We don't know. But here's a clue. Oh, the sun has sunspots in the northern hemisphere and in the southern hemisphere. And there's not a lot of data available to most of us who aren't professionals that show this data, but it's out there on the web. And the red line here is the sunspot number for the southern hemisphere of the sun. So those are the counts of the sunspots that are only below the solar equator. And in blue are the sunspots since 1945 that were produced north of the equator. And you'll notice over time, sometimes the northern hemisphere of the sun is more active than the southern hemisphere. So that back in 1970, the northern hemisphere peaked first, and the southern hemisphere had kind of a weak peak later. That's kind of like where we are now. But the 2 cycles before that, the southern hemisphere peaked first. And the other thing is that the peaks in the 2 hemispheres, they both have peaks. They never, ever occur at the same time, never. So kind of an interesting question for us right now is, when is the peak of the northern hemisphere going to happen? And here's what went on 100 years ago in that sunspot cycle 14, that double peaked one I showed you. And very clearly, 100 years ago, solar cycle 14, very similar to solar cycle 24, the northern hemisphere had a big peak. Our northern hemisphere is way ahead of the southern hemisphere, as you'll see. And then that second peak occurred when the southern hemisphere had its peak, and they were about 2 years apart. The last two sunspot cycles, back in around 2001, that real big 6-meter opening that happened right here, there were two peaks in 2000, 2001. They were 2 years apart. And then 10 years before that, the two peaks were 10 years apart also. Now, something really strange has been happening on the sun, and we don't know how to interpret what's happened over the last week or 10 days. Nobody knows yet. But notice how the northern part of the sun, these are the sunspot numbers in blue for the northern hemisphere of the sun. And clearly the southern hemisphere has been tracking way behind right up until the end of March when I produced this slide. And see the question mark, and we don't know whether the northern hemisphere is going to continue to go up or the southern hemisphere is going to go up or down. Nobody knows. Now, does anybody know this sunspot that's produced all of these X flares this week? What hemisphere is it in? Well, it's in the northern hemisphere. It's not in the southern hemisphere. It's in the northern. So it appears that the southern hemisphere isn't catching up yet. There's very little activity in the southern hemisphere this week. I didn't check this morning. All that activity, and it's one sunspot in particular, it's the northern hemisphere. So it appears like maybe the northern hemisphere peak could actually be here, happening over the next month. And the southern hemisphere peak, well, we don't know what's going on because it's still lagging way behind, way down here. Now, there's another measurement. I'm going to ask you to pay attention to this. And it's something most hams are not familiar with. But this is absolutely true. Solar maximum, in other words, the peak of solar cycle 24, usually, not always, but usually occurs when the magnetic field polarity of the northern hemisphere of the sun and the southern hemisphere of the sun, in the polar regions, when those polarities flip. So when both of them have flipped, that usually occurs at solar maximum. So, okay, so what's going on in solar cycle 24? Where do we stand? Here's the northern hemisphere that's been so active and is real active this week. Here's the field reversal right here, where the magnetic polarity of the northern polar region of the sun it changed polarity. So the northern hemisphere of the sun is well past field reversal. Okay, so one of them has switched. And this is smoothed data. It's not day by day, it's smooth. But the trend is undeniable. The northern hemisphere has made the switch. The southern hemisphere, very little sunspot activity in the southern hemisphere right up to this week. And it's nowhere near field reversal yet. And in fact, it's slowed down. So we don't know when this hemisphere is going to reverse polarity and get up into this region up here. Don't know. Nobody knows. There hasn't been any sunspot cycle like this in over 100 years. Good thing about this sunspot cycle. There's been relatively little X-flare activity. So the low bands have been generally pretty good. So for those people that enjoy working on 160 meters like my neighbor W3UR, he can work Afghanistan on 160 meters at the top of the sunspot cycle. For most sunspot cycles, 160 meters was terrible. So that's a good thing. And here's the last slide, and it'll be your turn. Some solar scientists expect the next solar cycle to be the weakest solar cycle in 400 years. That's not a prediction. Nobody's making that prediction, but there are undeniable trends that have people worried that if we didn't like solar cycle 24, just wait to 25. And that's the last slide. So this is your presentation now, so let's ask some questions. Yes?
They say that about 24, before 24 started to get hot. It said that it would be the weakest in 100 years.
Well, they were right, but they were, see, so the question is, didn't they say that 24 was going to be the weakest in 100 years? Well, whoever the they was right. But there was another set of scientists that said it was going to be a very big one, and there were others that said middling. In fact, if you remember early in the presentation, I said that there are two forecasts produced in the United States. One produced by NOAA out in Colorado, one produced by NASA in Texas. And Texas and Colorado don't seem to agree. Well, what else is new? Yep, usually.
Are you talking about north flips, the south and south, not north, but positive flips and negative?
Yeah. So let me explain that.
Have to flip at the same time?
No, they never flip at the same time.
No, you got right at the moment because
One that's flipped.
and we're both of them the same polarity.
Yes, it's a very strange situation. So here's the question for those that didn't hear it. Usually, solar maximum occurs when both fields have reverse polarity, the north polar region and the south polar region of the sun. When both have flipped polarity, that's usually solar maximum. Not always, but usually. So, what's happened here? The north hemisphere has gone from negative polarity to positive polarity at the end of 2011, back when that anomalous peak happened, when 10 and 15 meters were so good. But the southern hemisphere is really lazy. Nothing's happening down there. And I didn't mention this before, but the mechanism that allows the polarity flip to occur is the production of sunspots. So because the southern hemisphere is underperforming in the production of sunspots, it's not providing the mechanism for the magnetic field to reverse. And nobody knows, and notice this curve has flattened out. The rate of weakening. See what's happening here, the southern hemisphere is positive magnetic polarity, and the strength measured in microtesla is weakening over time. And that's the process of flipping from positive to negative. Well, the weakening of the solar southern hemisphere has slowed way down. And there's no evidence of it picking up so that this field reversal can happen. And nobody knows why, except sunspots being created.
So that means that if it follows the trend, that we need to have the peak continuing to rise until the red line gets up to 0.
Well, here's what I think right there. I think nobody knows. See, there hasn't been a sunspot cycle like this one in 100 years. And people weren't making these detailed measurements back in 1906. So if anybody tells you that they know, there's a lot of opinions. Some of those opinions will prove to be right, but I don't know how to pick the opinions. Yes? You're talking about the field reversal at maximum, right? There isn't a field reversal at minimum. That's when the maximum field occurs, is at minimum. The minimum field, you see, this is solar max, and the minimum field occurs at solar max as the field reversal is about to begin. So the minimum was back here when the field strength, the magnetic field strength in the polar region was at its maximum. So the solar minimum, no sunspots, corresponds to the maximum magnetic field strength of the polar regions of the sun. I don't know the answer. I don't know. The only thing that I know is that usually when both of them have reversed, that's solar max. But there could be an exception, because it is usually, not always. All the way in the back of the room. Somebody say something. All the way in the back. Yeah, that's right. So this is kind of the end of 2012, and this is smooth. So if you look at the detail measurements, they jump all around here like crazy. But the smooth data around the end of last year is when the very definite trend was that the northern hemisphere of the sun had switched from negative magnetic polarity to positive.
Okay, so one pole has reversed, the other one hasn't.
Yeah.
Does that mean both poles have the same polarity?
Well, it's worse than that. It's a crazy situation. We've got, if you look at the sun, if you look at the magnetic field across the face of the sun, the northern hemisphere is positive at the pole. And then as you go towards the equator, there's actually kind of the equivalent of another pole there where it flips again near the equator. So there's actually the magnetic field strength picture across the face of the sun is very confused. Because it's positive at the pole, it's kind of neutral down towards the equator, so it's a crazy situation that always occurs, but usually for a brief period of time during this flip period. And the most important thing is that we don't know what's going on here. We know what causes it. There aren't enough sunspots to allow this flip to occur. So when we start to see more sunspots in the southern hemisphere, then this field reversal can occur, and we have then probably hit solar maximum. Well, let me move on to the next, okay? Next question. Sure, I will do that. Okay, so the question is, can we expect another minimum? Well, notice, so here is a 250-year record of sunspots. And there was this thing we've heard of called the Dalton minimum that occurred back here around 1800. And then there's been this anomalous period in our lifetimes of unusually high solar activity. And some scientists are saying that solar cycle 25 might look like this. But nobody knows. I don't think anyone that we trust, based upon their performance, can ever predict the next sunspot cycle based upon, kind of being over here. Not quite at the one before. There's a lot of guesswork and a lot of rationale for this, but nobody really knows. But it's possible that this solar cycle 25 could be the lowest sunspot cycle in 1,000 years. That's possible. Nobody knows. Next question. Hey, if you like 160, it'll be fabulous. But I mean, so the question is, what are the bands going to be like if some of these scientists, these are well-respected guys, they're not jokers, well-respected solar scientists, some believe this can happen based upon some data that looks pretty convincing. Could be a really low sunspot cycle. So the 80 and 160 meters will be fabulous. Boy, if you like the other bands, not so much. It doesn't affect sporadic E as much, probably, so sporadic E in the summer will probably still be quite good. But there's been nothing like this in 1,000 years, so it'll be an adventure. Let's hope it doesn't happen. As much as I like 160 meters, I like the other bands too. Right here.
What is your prediction for CTU worldwide CW?
Well, okay, so the question is, what is my prediction for CTU worldwide CW? Let me preface that with a little comment. In my professional life, I'm retired, but in my professional life, for some period of time, I had the task of performing forecasts for some of the executives in my company. I'll tell you, if there's any way to make a fool out of yourself, get into the forecasting business, and I don't care what it is. You are guaranteed to make mistakes. And I am not going to stand in front of you here and make a prediction of something that I don't understand. But let me tell you what I hope will happen, okay? I'll tell you what I hope will happen, and that's the best that I can do. Something has really changed this week. The presentation I prepared is all messed up. Something has really changed. So let's hope that the sunspot peak for the northern hemisphere hasn't happened yet, and that thing that happened when conditions were so good at the end of 2011 was kind of an anomaly, and the real peak is going to happen back here when the NASA guys said it was going to happen. The NASA guys are saying we haven't seen the first peak yet. So I'm hoping the NASA guys that update this every month are right, and that CQ Worldwide's kind of right where that arrow is. So that's what I'm hoping for. That's as far as I'm going to go down that road. Any other questions? Yes, right in front of me here. Yeah, well, so there's an observation, there's a tremendous amount of chaos. We've only been studying the sun in any depth for 400 years, and the history of the sun goes back billions. So the understanding isn't that good. Just as an aside, one of the ways that solar physicists try to understand the sun is by finding other stars. Many, many stars have sunspots. Countless thousands, probably millions of stars have the equivalent of the sunspots we have on our little sun. So some solar physicists are studying other suns that are in various phases of their life to see what things could be like. But there's a wide-held view. So here's that 400-year track, this anomaly in our lifetime of high solar activity. There's a widely held view that this is an anomaly, and that, you know, the more normal thing is kind of over here, where solar cycle 24 is. Any other questions? Right in front.
I keep looking at that. I know nobody else is involved in this, but I do recall the time period there at the end of the 50s, 60s,
Yep.
like there's a worldwide band all the time.
Right here, that peak.
But what I'm curious about is when we go back to the mid-1850s, when there was that huge CME that charged all the fences and telegraph lines.
Telegraphers got electrocuted.
Exactly. I'm looking for any correlation to give us any ideas about the CME issue and what that means. Correlation at all. It's 1850 something.
Yeah, it was in the early days of the telegraph.
Right. Right. I mean, this is coming. And what's it mean to us? And is there any way to see what's happening?
Unfortunately, there is no credibility to any process of trying to compare trends to create credible forecasts. The most reliable way that solar scientists have found is to try to understand the underlying mechanisms on the sun, and there's been tremendous progress over the last 10 years in trying to, you've probably heard of some of the research and what's going on kind of below the surface of the sun that transports some of these magnetic regions around the sun. So there's been a lot of progress in understanding not the symptoms, and these are just the symptoms. Sunspots are just the symptom of magnetic activity in the core of the sun, or closer to the surface. They're symptoms, they're not fundamental processes. And a great deal of progress has happened just over the last 10 years, right here, in understanding what causes this stuff. But there isn't any credible person who can take any kind of statistical view of what's going on and say those statistics here or here have anything to do with any kind of a credible ability to predict what's going to happen next year or 10 years from now.
The concern is with such a discharge with the technology we have now would be.
Yeah, but nobody knows. And you can be sure that the thing that happened to the telegraphers back in the 1850s is going to happen again someday. And back in some of these earlier sunspot cycles, the electrical grid that didn't exist in the 1850s was severely damaged up in Quebec. 20 years ago or so. Those things are going to happen. We just don't know when. Maybe not in our lifetimes. We don't know. Right over here.
We look at the data, look at that graph that says 400 years of sunspot observation. So clearly they've got one measurable variable that they're looking at and then predicting the rise and fall. As you're presenting data that's actually, as you point out, much more sophisticated in the last 10 to 20 years, and obviously some of that data probably was not measured earlier. Out of curiosity, is there anything based on the new modern data that they can go back and look at the older data and like reconfigure it?
Boy, that's a really good question. So here's the question. Let me know if I got this right. So there's been a resurgence in the profession of solar physics. Solar physics up until the last few years has been kind of a quiet professional activity. There are a lot more solar physicists now than there were 5, 6, 7 years ago. The sun is really interesting because it's doing things that it hasn't done in 100 years. And it's become an interesting science. So is there anything that's going on to try to understand what went back here? Well, in fact, some of these very well-known solar scientists are going back into this data in the 19th century to try to correct it, because it turns out it's wrong. The methods that were used back in this area to count sunspots and the telescopes they had available were not as good as, we're using satellites now, and they didn't even dream of satellites back here. So we have much better methods, and this data is miscalibrated. And there's a lot of work going on now in NOAA, primarily, to try to recalibrate this data. But I'm not sure that they'll be able to better understand the underlying physics of the sun that caused this data. They'll just be able to get the data better calibrated. So, that's not an ideal answer to your question, but it's an important question, and a lot of people are looking at it. But, the sun is an unbelievably complex physical, it's an unbelievably complex star, and we've only just scratched the surface in understanding what's going on. Any other questions? Right here. Well, so the question is there a single website that has a lot of good data? Well, first of all, it depends on what you mean by good. Is it data that you like? If you're a top band guy, you probably like somebody's data more than you like the data for a guy that likes to work 10 meters. So the definition of good is it's impossible to know if the data's good. But there's a site that a lot of the solar physicists tend to exchange their views. And you find a lot of debate. It's kind of like our reflectors, contest reflector, top band reflector. There's a lot of discussions. Is it this? Is it that? What's important? And that site is What's Up With That. WATTSUPWITHTHAT. That's a site that's primarily oriented towards climate change. And I'm not going to touch that either. But the sun has a lot to do with climate change, and it has a lot to do with other things. So a lot of the solar scientists exchange their views, and there's a lot of disagreements on whatsupwiththat.com. And if you're interested in looking at the debates, that's a good place. Yes?
Prior to the 1750
honestly, I don't recall. I don't know. So that's about the best I can say. Any other questions? Okay. Well, I hope I got your interest going. It's going to be interesting to follow what's going on. The data about the polarity of the sunspots is available on the web. It's on the NOAA website that's linked from spaceweather.com. So if you go to spaceweather.com, at the bottom of the page, you can link on the site that goes to all the ionospheric data. And every evening at 0030 Zulu, so 8:30 p.m. in the summer, the data about the sunspot activity in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere is updated. So if you're kind of curious about what's going on, that's a good place to look. And if you're interested in this data, that's also updated about twice a month by the Wilson Solar Observatory, WSO.com. And they update the data on the magnetic field strength here and the polarity about twice a month. Okay, guys, thanks a lot.